Welcome to Talaterra, a podcast about freelance educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. Who are these educators? What do they do? Join me, and let's find out together. This is your host, Tanya Marion. Today, my guest is Dr. Brad McLain, a social scientist interested in the nature and psychology of identity development, learning, and leadership. Dr. McLain is the director of the Center for STEM Learning at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he's a senior researcher and the director of corporate research at the National Center for Women in Information Technology. I reached out to Dr. McLain after reading a chapter he wrote about identity construction in informal science educators. I've learned that since writing this chapter, Dr. McLain's research has expanded to include transformative experiences. In this episode, we discuss identity theory. We discuss what informal science educators have in common with independent environmental education professionals. We discuss Dr. McLain's work as chair of Jane Goodall's U.S. Roots and Shoots program, and his current research dedicated to the design of transformative experiences. What is identity theory? How do transformative experiences work? Let's find out. Well, Brad, thank you so much for stopping by today to talk about identity construction in informal science educators. And so welcome.
My pleasure. My favorite topic. Well, one of my favorite topics.
Would like to explain to listeners how or why I reached out to you. I reached out to you because I had read your chapter about identity construction in informal science educators. I had read about your experiment on how you came to assess how the educators identified themselves, and also, I guess, when they identified themselves as educators. And there were a lot of your paper really resonated with me because I saw right away that the informal science educators that you described had a lot in common with the independent environmental education professionals who I work with and who I have conversations with. And so, if I may, I'm going to quickly point out what jumped out at me in your chapter. And so I saw right away that the educators you described and the independent professionals I work with have these types of things in common. Okay, both cover a range of subjects, both bring a strong set of values to their work, both want to make a difference with the work that they do. The informal science educators you describe and the independent environmental education professionals who I have conversations with, both groups enjoy the flexibility and social nature of their work. Both tend to work in isolation, and both groups have limited professional development opportunities. And the individuals in both groups came to what they do currently from many different pathways. There wasn't a straight line. And that really jumped out at me. He said, oh boy, these are groups of professionals who have an awful lot in common. And so I continued to read your chapter, and just lots of bells and whistles went off as I read your work. Now, I do not have a background in identity theory, but I'm very interested in when the independent professionals I speak with claim their identity as a freelancer and claim their identity as a professional, and then how they act on that. And so that is one of my interests in what I do and the type of conversations I try to have with people. Right. And so if you could explain to us or help us understand what identity theory is.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, come from a background of identity theory. I didn't either. I came at this whole topic through being an informal science educator myself. And, the identity crisis of the whole field, as we've called ourselves informal science educators, non-formal science educators, free choice educators, all of these, anything to differentiate ourselves from formal classroom educators. And these words, we try them on for size like blue jeans at the store. Do they fit? Well, maybe this week, but we have to wait until we break them in a little bit. And so when I started looking more closely at the ways we arrive at these careers and are effective in them, that draw me onto professional development, which we know there were very few opportunities for real professional development, structured, organized professional development, or even degree programs. There are a few now in informal science communication and education. And so how is it that people are forming their trajectories into those careers and staying there, right? Because you don't grow up thinking, I'm going to be a museum or science center educator, in the same way that some kids will grow up and say, I want to be a teacher. And so we arrive at these careers through all these different trajectories, and it's a professional potpourri. Sometimes it's a second or third career, sometimes it's a first career, but in any case, it usually is a transition into something else. Steps on the path rather than a destination. And so I was curious about why is this, and how's that happening? And invariably, trying to get smart about that and reading all I could about it led me into the idea of identity development, identity construction, identity formation. Well, that was a wilderness. And I did my dissertation on this subject because, we had different definitions of identity depending on what field you came from. As is often the case in social science, they have different jargons and terms for concepts like identity, depending on where you're coming from. So the educators in educational theory, they had one idea about what identity meant. The psychologists, a different pedigree of identity, and the sociologists, different one indeed. So I had to kind of pick which one was I going to go with, which one would serve my ends best in investigating this question of how do informal science educators develop a sense of professional identity. And it turns out it's the sociology angle that I was gravitating toward. It seemed to have the most robust and useful set of ideas and a structure around thinking about and researching about identity and how it happens. And so I hooked my wagon to that legacy of intellectual inquiry and never looked back. I mean, I'd borrow some from psychology and education, of course, but you find that they overlap. They might use different words, but we're all trying to zero in on the same idea of a sense of self. And in sociology, a professional identity would be categorized under a role identity. It's a role that we play in society, but it's also social identity, which we know informal science educators struggle with, often feeling isolated, as you pointed out, from the rest of their peers or even the profession in general. And so as a social identity that connects us to others, there's a lot we could do to support environmental science, different kinds of science communication and informal science education professionals. There's a lot of them. So a roundabout way of saying that's how I got interested in identity construction in this particular playing field.
In your paper, you discuss what your motivation for this particular research project was, and for your research in general. And I'm going to quote from your paper here. You mentioned that the motivation for your research was to address, and I quote, barriers to recruitment, retention, and elevate the field's professional standards, unquote, in response to high turnover among informal science educators who work as frontline staff.
That's a really institutional view. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like, if I was like commander in chief of this whole organization or a whole network of organizations, how do I make this better? The individual view is how can I make the experience better for myself? But as an organization, I don't want to hire a bunch of people, train them, and then have them leave with all that expertise, that intellectual capital and experience that they got here, and then they walk out the door and have to start over again. It's a huge cost. It's a huge creative cost. It's actually a bottom line financial cost too. So it's the same problem experienced in different ways if you're an individual or an organization, I think.
And what has helped with the high turnover that you've seen so far in your experience?
When people stay in these careers, it's because they have somehow, and usually stumbling into it, found a way to develop an identity that includes informal science education and to wear it as a badge of honor, and as opposed to, I'll do this for now as I make my way through to that other thing that I want. And so it's a temporary identity for me. But the ones that we find who have stayed and really fallen in love with it may do with the content that they're teaching. For example, you mentioned environmental education. That's a really highly passionate field where the people who are involved in it aren't doing it for the money. They're doing it because they're trying to save the world. Now, I've had the pleasure of working with Jane Goodall for many years, served on her board of directors, was the chair of the Roots and Shoots U.S. program. That's her education program. And it used to be that we would look at Roots and Shoots, which is a program, an informal science education program where kids of all ages, I always say K to gray, would assemble groups informally with a facilitator and embark on creating campaigns to benefit people, animals, or the environment in their local communities. It used to be that we would look at how they did this, and the results of their campaigns might be something like, let's pick up the trash in the wilderness area, or keep a creek clean, or let's do some animal adoption as opposed to euthanizing them at the local humane society, anything like that. But it used to be that we'd look at their campaigns and evaluate them for success in terms of how well they met their goals. After we applied identity theory to look at Roots and Shoots, we changed the goal. The goal didn't become how successful were the campaigns. The goal became how successful is the experience of pursuing these efforts in creating identities for the kids who are participating as change agents. Like Jane herself, an agent of change in the world. Now, my campaign might succeed and might fail, but the experience of having done it, does it change my sense of self, the way I think about myself, and therefore modify my identity and may affect my future choices, my future aspirations, my future directions in life? And that became more interesting to us than just looking at the outcomes of a specific campaign. Like, did you clean up the creek? Did you get that trash? How much did you get? Did you save these number of animals? Yes, maybe, yes, no. Some campaigns are more successful than others for a variety of reasons, but the experience of doing it. Now, if we jump from that to informal science educators, somehow the ones who stay are the ones who have recognized the impact of the work on their personal lives and owned it, wanted to be part of it, to integrate it into their sense of self. I say this, they stumble into it because there are no structures, almost no structures, in the professional development or training or retention, even the recruiting of informal science educators by science centers and museums and all these other places, other programs, to facilitate that. It's an accident if it happens, or it happens because of the volition of an individual. The way we train and prepare informal science educators doesn't attend, as I make the case in that book chapter, it doesn't attend to these elements. And so the cry here is to say, what happens if we do attend to those things? How might we change the experience for individuals, but also transform the field and the profession of informal science education to a destination career? And then retention. So my argument is retention is increased when we do this, and it's off to the wind if we don't.
Okay. In that chapter, you describe a theater program that you led with a group of educators and demonstrated one way that professional development could look. Okay, and so what might professional development look like if it weren't content focused? And if it were viewed as identity building now that you are years removed from that project, how might that look to you now?
Yeah, it's funny because at the time when we did that project, we arrived with looking at our data and the research afterwards at 3 outcome categories. And we said professional developers of informal science education do well to look at their professional development programs and evaluate them in these 3 categories. And they're kind of deepening as you go. On the surface, it would be awareness and content learning. So, education. So you get familiar with new content or something like that. And then at the deepest end, it would be this transfer of skills and interests to other areas of your work, so that you're professionally developing someone to learn about something. Maybe they have to deliver a program and they have to get smart about the content. Maybe it's climate change or something like that. But then the next step beyond that is engagement, personal engagement and caring about it. Do we attend to that in our professional development? How does this content or this program relate to me personally? And can I bring that experience, that lived experience that I have, into this? That's where we see environmental educators so passionate about their work. And then the third one is, can I transfer the skills and processes and outlooks that I've acquired in this professional event to other areas of my work or my life? That's what we thought at the end of this program. Well, like you said, it's been a few years since then, and my research has changed its question in general to examine transformative experiences. What these are experiences that we have, not just education experiences, but any experience that you have in your life that in some way changes your sense of self. That is to say, modifies or creates new identities in that carefully guarded volume of identities in your identity library. I always say your most valued and protected, treasured possession is your bookshelf of identities. And so experiences that add to or modify those books on that shelf are the ones that are transformative in nature. What is required, no matter the details, to have a transformative experience? And if we understood that, if we understood some of those elements, could we use it as educators, as leaders, as parents, as coaches? Any mentor who's a protege, could we use that to help design transformative experiences? And I think for informal science educators, the question is, could we design professional development for them so that their learning about how to do their jobs and do it better transforms not only their capacity and their skills, but also their sense of self?
And what have you seen that works or that's been successful?
Well, yes, we have actually an entire framework, and a book that I'm working on right now is coming out about this time next year, probably. But it's called the Elvis Framework. It's the Experiential Learning Variables and Indicators System. And we looked at about 1,200 cases of people in different walks of life and at different ages to find out what their transformative experiences were and what they had in common. Now, they're obviously very different in circumstance and details, even in duration. But what were, if you could boil them down and reduce them to the common ingredients, what were the things inside those transformative experiences that seemed to be essential, in a phenomenological sense? The biggest one, and this is even foreshadowed in the book chapter from the book you read, is risk, perceived risk, actually. So the idea that we don't grow and change and transform in our comfy, cozy couches and living rooms. We actually have to get up, walk out the door, and get out into our discomfort zones. It's the only place where that kind of growth takes place. So if we look at professional development for informal science educators, we can ask, what is the invitation here in this professional development opportunity for educators to take a chance, to become uncomfortable, to be put into a situation where they have to stretch themselves? And if that's not there, if that ingredient that's at the top of the list is not there, I'd say you don't have much of a chance of a transformative or identity impacting experience. So it's a simple litmus test. Professional development for educators, is it going to be content centered? Okay, then be it, so be it. That's what most of it is. If it's learner centered, educator centered, then does it have this chance, this risk, this opportunity or an invitation to take a chance on a personal level into a discomfort zone? And if it does, well, then you're on the right track. It's not the only thing you need, but it's the big thing that you need to have. What does risk look like? It's different for different people, I think.
The 1,200 individuals, I assume, in the sample size in in your research, or the
Yeah, this was
1,200 conversations?
over many different projects. In fact, the one that was written about in the book chapter was called STEPS, Science, Theater, Education, Programming System, I think. Into acronyms, aren't we? Jeez, that's what we do as academics. But that one, that was early on in some of these investigations. We were looking at educators. But since then, different projects have looked at children, adults, corporate executives, coaches, athletes, and teachers of different sorts as well. And asking these questions: what are their transformative experiences, and how do they narrate them? How do they interpret them? How do they change over time? Because they do change over time as we grow older. I always like to say our personal stories, they always change, like the old proverbial fish story. The fish was this big when I caught it, but now I've told the story 20 times and it's 20 times bigger.
Yeah. Let's see.
The other thing about it is that we don't attend to, especially as science educators. We're so focused on the science sometimes and getting that science up to a certain standard that we forget about the emotional component, the social and emotional component. And so as educators, we can ask that of our professional development. What are the opportunities to connect the dots between the science content and the emotional content that goes with it? And that has to do with the interpretation of it. Well, I like to call the so what question. Yes, so we know that greenhouse gases are increasing the burning of fossil fuels, contributing to the atmosphere, retaining heat, and causing climate change in this way. So what? What's the so what? The so what is that we should care because it's not only going to affect humans, it's going to affect every living cousin that we have in our ecosystems and the entire living planet. So why do we care about that? So what? And you keep asking the so what question, and eventually you get to an emotional component of the learning. There's an old Bruce Lee quote, the martial artist Bruce Lee. He was probably paraphrasing somebody else, but he had this great quote. And I was a lifelong martial artist myself, so I dabbled in his writings. He said, all learning ultimately, all knowledge is ultimately self-knowledge. If you keep asking that question, so what, so what, so what, in a professional development forum, you'll finally get down to why do you care? Why do you care about it? And if an informal science educator can answer that question, why do I care about it, and become emotionally invested, they can then interpret that content in their program design, instructional design for their attendees, their visitors, their audiences, so that the audiences can do the same thing. And I think that's the real power of an educator, is to lend a perspective that connects this learning, this content, to an emotional, personal level. And if they can model that themselves, then they can include it in the experience of their audiences. And then you have potentially a transformative experience for audiences as well. But we don't teach people how to do it. If they do it, informal science educators do it because they intuitively know how. Like our best teachers in classrooms intuitively know how. We don't include that kind of thing in their professional preparation in teachers' college either. Why not? Why do we not do this? This is a really interesting question.
Yes, I hear what you're saying. I am a member of the National Association for Interpretation, and for heritage interpreters, the focus is to create emotional and intellectual connections with a site or with a resource. And I've read, programs with classroom teachers. They go somewhere and then they learn about a site, the culture and heritage of a particular location, of the people who live there. And it's always, from what I gather, it's always a moving experience. And I've wondered myself, well, what if classroom teachers were first experienced interpretation and then went into all the important trainings for working in a formal classroom? Would that, if they switched it around, would that be different?
I do. I think, that's the difference between a content-centered approach and a learner-centered approach. That Elvis model that I mentioned earlier, the experiential learning variables and indicator system that had risk at the top. One of the other elements in it is meaning making. And how do humans make meaning out of what they experience and learn? And most importantly, how do they make meaning out of their experience of themselves, their identities? And it turns out that we're hardwired to narrate our experiences to ourselves and others. We do it through stories. Our cultures are built on stories. Our histories are built on stories. Yes, even our understanding of science and the world that works, the way it works, is built on stories. Individually, at best, in an education setting, usually in formal education, you have some reflection, maybe some journaling, something like that, or a facilitated discussion while we wait for the bus to come and pick us up. But I'm talking about deeper meaning making that's embedded in, not just tagged on, like pin the tail on the donkey at the end of the experience, but integrated and structured into the design of an experience, whether that be professional development for an educator or the designed program that they're working on in their museum or science center. How can we embed it? Especially difficult when you only have an audience for a short amount of time. Formal educators, they have their kids all year, or at least for 2 semesters. We might have them for 20 minutes at an encounter on the floor of the science center, or we might have them for 2 hours or a week, but not much more than that usually. And so how do we embed meaning making into these experiences? Well, there are ways to do this. There are multiple ways to do it, and we don't attend to it very much in the professional development of educators. And it ranges from everything from discussion and challenges to each other's ways of thinking, to sharing and comparing, to journaling, like I mentioned before, to video documentary, personal documentary creation, one of my favorites, where we have people create documentaries of their experiences with their phones. They can shoot and edit and even add music and text. Everything is right. You got a little movie studio in your pocket. And then I always love to have them make director's commentary to overlay an audio track. Why did you choose this? How did you choose to edit this way? And why did you do, all of that kind of thing. Even podcasting, like we're doing today, is a way for people to explore and express the meaning that they're making out of an experience. We know this: if we don't attend to it and structure for meaning making, it may not happen. Or if it does, it may not happen in a focused, directed way that has as much powerful impact as it might. It's a missed opportunity. If we do attend to it, then we open the floodgates for this identity impact that we might see, and the potential for a transformative experience that changes us in some important and durable way.
I participated in this was 2014, the Free Choice Learning Program at Oregon State in the certificate program. And I stayed on one extra semester because I wanted to learn how to design tabletop activities in STEM, STEM activities in a museum. What's that one extra step? So it was a year plus a semester. And I love that program because so much thought went into thinking about it in ways that I hadn't had the opportunity to think about it before,
Yes.
in so many different ways. And then
Yes.
also the experience of doing observations in a museum and speaking with visitors and all that, and observing how they made meaning of what they were seeing in an exhibition, and all that was. So for me, that was my transformative experience. That was really a special program to me.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it just,
that.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And it really reinforced my interest in adult learning.
Yeah, the idea that you would observe and learn how to observe people experiencing these environments and these designed experiences in a museum or science center, it really casts you as an educator into the role of a social scientist. What am I learning from these observations? What am I hearing? What am I seeing? What signals are they sending about their experience? Positive, negative, neutral, what might they be? Because they're always sending signals to us if we're attentive to receiving those signals, and then modifying our approach. I think too often we have a one-size-fits-all or one-size-fits-most approach to our curricular design. And so we sit around with our colleagues and we design something. Maybe it's a class, maybe it's an encounter cart or something like that. Maybe it's an entire lab or something in a museum or a science center. And we stop after we've established what it should be. Here's what we'll do first and second and third, and here's the content. We'll train some people up on it, and we'll go out and sprinkle this holy water on the masses. No, what about the idea that we also need to modify what we're doing in real time and think on our feet based on feedback that we're getting during the experience? How do we train for that? How do we prepare for that? If we don't, then we do have, by de facto, default, it's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. And guess what? This has failed us in formal education for a long time, because if the kid doesn't fit into that, we turn around and say, what's wrong with that kid? Let's call the parents up. Parent conference, your kid doesn't fit into this. What's wrong with them? I hate these conferences. I've had them with my kids. And I'm like, let's flip the script. What's wrong with the environment in which the kid is? Because I'm pretty sure there's not too much wrong with the kid, right? In most situations, we see that the rigid agent is the curricular design, and the flexibility that's needed to address different people and meet them where they are is missing. Now, that's not always true, right? There's intervention programs and ways that formal education does a pretty good job at that, depending on the school. But we don't see that as much in museums and science centers and other programs. It's not as professionalized. We don't take it as seriously. It's more in recreation or fun mode, which seems to make it less important, or we don't need to attend to that because it's just a nice little program. And that's the old way of thinking about the field, right? If we professionalize it and we get serious about it and apply psychology and learning psychology to it, we suddenly have the potential to make these very important experiences for people. And by all means, there's people walking around who report that they became a scientist or decided on a career move or what they wanted out of life based on that one trip they had to the science center when they were 14 years old or 12 years old or something. And how do you capture that lightning in a bottle? How do you make those potentialities more likely to happen instead of less likely? I think part of it is being flexible and not having a one-size-fits-all curriculum, but having people who are trained, prepared, and designing for understanding who's in their audience and meeting them where they are. So it becomes more personally relevant. And that's another element of the Elvis model, is personal relevance. How does this connect socially, emotionally, individually, intellectually with me as a person? If it doesn't, if I have fewer lines of connection to whatever I'm learning, I'm not going to care as much. But sometimes I need to be shown why I should care. In steps the talented and wise educator, or not, as the case may be.
Yeah. But in a free choice learning environment where the visitor has choice and control, they can look your direction or not. It is not easy to prepare for, every type of person who might walk up to you, or who you might have the opportunity to engage with. Then that's always going to be the case. But then to be responsive in that type of a fast-moving environment over a tabletop activity or over, whatever the level of engagement is, that's not easy to do.
Well, I think there's a difference between diagnosing what somebody might want or should get from your experience, and having to figure out that riddle, which is very difficult, versus like the free choice model where you offer a number of invitations, a number of access methods and modes and levels that different people might take advantage of on their own volition, by their free. I mean, that's the spirit of the free choice twist on informal and non-formal learning environments, is that people will select what avenue they want to engage in the conversation, the learning, but they need to be presented with more than one. Because if they don't recognize themselves in that one invitation, they'll skip over it and not experience it at all. If we can offer multiple invitations to the same content, either as educators or into the design of it that we've done, before we start interacting with the audience personally, then we can think of ourselves, and we do this with corporate leaders quite a bit, by the way, in tech companies, and working a lot now with invitational leadership. And the idea that there's a phrase borrowed from David White, a poet who also works with corporate entities quite a bit. Invitational leadership is such that you're inviting someone to a deeper participation in the learning or the doing of an organization. In the sense of a encounter at the museum and the science center, you're inviting them to a deeper participation where they bring themselves into the conversation, thereby changing the experience. It's not just a passive experience, but this interactive experience. What we all love about informal science education has more potential for interaction sometimes than formal education, more freedom, more degrees of freedom. So what are the invitations to that deeper conversation that we're making? And how can we make them in different ways for different people? Again, we don't think about or talk about this in the professional development of informal science educators often enough.
What might a community-based educator do to take that first step, the smallest viable step they can take to gaining better, deeper understanding of their actions and of how they engage with the public? When I started this project, I've learned that for people who I've been interacting with, they really do work through their communities in all sorts of settings. So it's not the nature centers and museums and the zoos and the places where you might expect to find them. It's also in corporate settings. It's also at dinners. It's in libraries, at community centers, and all sorts of all these other venues that really don't show up on the radar. Mm-hmm. How might they begin to bring something new and emotional to their programs?
Yeah. This is exactly what we're working with lots of corporate execs right now with. It's called experience design leadership. And it's different than experiential design, which some educators might be familiar with. Let's go out and do stuff and interact on. Experience design leadership asks us as educators or facilitators, interpreters, to cast ourselves as experienced designers. And this is really the entire topic of my book about designing transformative experiences. Whether you're a coach or a parent or a teacher or a corporate leader, whatever you are, if the mentor of proteges, cast yourself now as an experienced designer. And don't focus so much on the outcome, so the standards that you've got to hit or the content you've got to get through, but the nature of the experience itself. And then once you've done that, flip the script and begin with the end in mind. At the end of this experience, which I'm going to design, what is the narrative that my audience members will go away with? In other words, I know they were going to form a narrative about the experience. Like you and I doing this podcast today, we'll have narratives. You'll have yours. Hey, I talked to this Brad guy today and blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, yeah, we talked about the identity stuff to my friends and we'll have our stories about it. We will do this because our brains are wired for this. And so if we attend to it as experienced designers, we'll say, what is the kind of narrative I'd like someone to come out of the experience with? And then the third one is, how can I facilitate the formation of that narrative? So those three things. First, cast yourself as an experienced designer and make that the priority one. And the content and the skills and the standards, whatever else you might have to do, that's secondary. So what's the experience? Two, what's the narrative, beginning with the end in mind, the ultimate narrative at the end of this that I would like people to walk out of? What kind of narrative? I can't control the specifics and don't want to, but what kind of narrative? Is it an inspirational narrative? Is it a challenging narrative? Is it an urgency narrative? And then how can I facilitate in the experience pathways for them to develop it, which means I need to incorporate the audience members themselves into the experience. It can't be a passive sidelines watch or delivery mode. No sage on the stage. What's the old saying? Don't be a sage on the stage, be a guide on the side. It's kind of like that. You don't want to just put your audience into a passive, disempowered role, but you want to actually engage them and invite them, invitational again, to not only participate in the experience, but by their participation, change the experience. Change the experience beyond what you would or could design. Eventually, if you are an experienced designer, your experiencers will take over and stretch out these new wings and take flight if you're successful. And you have to let them go. And then at that point, your designs fall away as they seize it and go with it on their own. And that's a very good sign, although it's a very uncomfortable place to be if you're the kind of educator who wants to control every element and every bit of the sequence of an experience. So it's a tension between designing an experience and letting an experience unfold in an uncharted way. To become an appreciator of that process, I think, is key.
This has been wonderful, Brett. Thank you so much. And when will your book be out?
Well, if I meet my deadlines, about Thanksgiving 2022. And they don't even have a title yet. The working title is Designing Transformative Experiences. And it's for leaders of all ilks, and even those who are just leading their own lives. So it covers a lot of territory, but it's stocked full of personal stories, enmeshed with a little psychology and sociology to give it some teeth. But it's the personal stories inside of it that are really, I think, powerful. Which, by the way, as we all know, as informal science educators, one of the best ways to teach. Story teaching, one of my favorite modes, especially for establishing that personal relevance and emotional connection to the learning.
I saw in your TED Talk called Inspire Me, you mentioned that that everyone is a storyteller and a story hearer.
You don't have a story unless you have both, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I think, as storytellers, we're always listening to our own stories. I think we can get tired of our own stories sometimes and the retelling of them. And so that discomfort zone comes up again when we invite ourselves to either evolve those stories or embark on entirely new ones. And so I think we are all storytellers and story hearers, but may we not get stuck in our storied ruts. Yeah, we always be authoring new stories, and thereby growing, I think, is the key to an invigorated life.
To learn more about Dr. McLain's research, his chapter about the identity of informal science educators, and to watch his TEDx talk, visit the show notes for this episode. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tanya Marion.